Well, hello everyone, and welcome back again for the salvage joke. I'm talking about right here is that you have right here is I went ahead and sketched right here. You're using a pen of example right here of an old clunker car. I know about a friend of mine that wants to, a gentleman that I know is like that wants to tear up an old car, and that this was right here was a story based on the fact about that any salvage cars and knowing about that the people are going to be driving them to the point to where knowing about whenever they're ready to beat the dust. But you see right here is I'll go ahead and use right here is the brush tool right here. And if anybody were warned to where that anything about related to the fact about is to where that anything about with old clunker cars and with anything about old clunker cars is it see here, go ahead and change this right here. But anyway, old clunker cars that we would like say that want to tear up, and if anybody were warned where that if it's going to be anything about clunker cars that warrant to where that you tear up an old car and you know about in order to tear up an old car that may require like it's you got to get the owner's permission or anything like that, but or if I say that hop into one of those old cars right there. But you see right here is yeah, right here is the color guy right here. But knowing about it's like for a junk car is it taking it to taking it to the salvage yard, especially if anybody were warned where taking the car to the salvage yard and you're like warned where there's something about that that I don't like. Like there's something about the what? There's something about the that I don't like. Oh, okay, well it's already in the junkyard, okay? Like it's already in the junkyard, so you don't have to worry too much about to where that that anything about if you want to tear something up, which see here, go ahead and switch right here, paintbrush right here, and see here, go ahead and but anyway, but you have right here is like a with like anything about if anybody say that that have right here's the gentleman inside one of those old cars, and he's like one to where that you can hop into one of those old cars, and I say, what are you doing in there? Like, I'm about ready to take this piece of junk to the junkyard. That's what I'm gonna do. Like, well, what do you want to do? Like, because I don't like the sound of that rolling thunder. It's like those rolling thunder, bam, 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 bam. But on the other hand, I talk about right here between junkyard parts and any kind of junkyard parts that were like warrant or anything you would find in a typical junkyard. And here right here is the engine right here. And let's just say this was an example right here of the engine right here. And if anybody like warrant or here right there is the engine. And like knowing about that with the engine right there that it would have like the different parts or anything like that right there. But go ahead and see what I can do here about see here changing this no, but you have right here is like with the engine right here, and just to make it look like something like this to where if it was an old clunker right here. And if anybody wanted to, there's something about the that I don't like. Like, oh, okay, well, it's been on the highway, and plus, it's already been. It's like to where that it's like even the policeman even pulled the guy over, but didn't know about as to where other ways of how you want to tear up an old car. Like, and you drive it up to a drive it to a nearest salvage yard, and you're like warning to her, hey, that like, oh, okay, you'll be able to find any parts that you need for the car here. I can actually, I'm here to tear the car up. I'm not here necessarily to keep it running. But on the other hand, you see right here is like, there's something about the that I don't like. There's something about the like, and there's something about the that I don't like. Oh, the well, guess what? I'm like, doing it, and that is going to get that person back and forth to work. I'm like, nobody really needs it. Like, he needs a vehicle that's going to take them 3 hours to drive to work and 3 hours to drive back wherever they need to go. And I'm like, well, sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do just to be able to get to where you gotta go, a destination. But see right here's a few other examples right here, some old rusted cars. But you're like wondering toward it, yeah, about how old is too old, just to know about the car. The car is ready to, it's like the ready to give out or play it out or whichever. If anybody were wondering to her, yeah. By the way, I'm like, what about the title to the car? I'm like, at the time that you're like wondering to where you're going to be driving the car to the point to where that sometimes you're like wondering to where if there's going to be a missing title to the car, knowing about for the salvage vehicle. And you're like wondering to her, there's something about the there's something about the that like, well, what about the like, well, about the well, I guess what? It's like we even heard it like that apparently that they can't find the title to to that car. Like, well, what does that mean? That basically means is to her that that either that the car that don't it can't drive anymore, or more likely you have to use the parts to like, and then on your hand too is that you drive the car somewhere and people weren't to where yeah that you drive the car for so long to where half the time you're like, well, what'd you find in the trunk? We didn't find anything because it don't even have a trunk. Yeah, it's like the trunk's been torn to pieces. Yeah, it don't even have the trunk is no longer there. Like, oh, okay, well, what? But still, that have right here is a. It's like with the exhaust right here, and if anybody that wanted tour, yeah, that go ahead and add in right here. It just was here was like some exhaust right here. If anybody wants tour, yeah, that the type of it, yeah, the type of exhaust, it looks more something like this right here. But anyway, if anybody say, yeah, by the time you start the car up, bam, 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 and then all like you have it right here is a cloud of smoke right here, and you're like wondering to where that what does it sound like whenever the car's in park? Bam, 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 bam. What does it sound like whenever you put the car in reverse? Bam, 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 bam. And what does it sound like whenever you put the car in drive? Bah, 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 bah. And you're like wondering to her, oh, okay, so it's going to sound like each and every time that you change gear, huh? Like, pretty much, yeah, that's pretty much what it sounds like. It sounds like, it sounds like, it sounds like, Now I know I'm not really at the time between 1 and 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. If anybody wanted to, or if that's really the water heater that you hear, or if that's the just right down the street. Like, well, apparently that that you're talking about is in the junkyard. Like, well, I wonder, like, know about it. You'll find, like, if anybody say that they have the gentleman that you're going to be having people help with, it's like to where anything that you want to do with the car, you weld the doors shut on both sides and want to, like, you take it to the demo, and you're, like, wanting to, or anything about the car engine especially. And at the time, you're like, yeah, that, at the time, with anything that you may find inside of a car necessarily, and, you're like wondering to where that some of these could be what you call used parts or anything like that, alternator or timing belt or exhaust pipe or anything like that, your radiator, and you're like wondering to where there's something about the that we don't like, well, and anything that more likely anything to do with maybe salvage, more likely you'll be able to find in a junkyard. Like, well, I tell you one thing that really that you go to a junkyard and you may find anything particular, such as anything used stuff or anything that keep the engine running, but then on your hand that you're like wondering to her at the time you do something about the that you don't like. Well, there's something about the like. Yeah, and I tell you one thing that you're like wanting to worry about old cars. That with any kind of old car, you're going to continue driving them, but sometimes you're like wanting to worry that to be able to keep the car running, even though if you have the right parts to do it. And some that may say, well, what about the tools and maybe about the higher wire maintenance or anything like that. But you have right here is example right here of I say of a and then you have right here is a lawnmower right here. And if anybody wants to with the lawnmower that I'm talking about right here, go ahead and change that color right there. Go ahead and add like a little example right here of a lawnmower. If anybody like wanted to, what exactly did the lawnmower like? Well, I mean, there's something about the lawnmower. Yeah, if you heard that sound, that sounds like. whenever you're early in the morning, especially on Saturday or Sunday or so morning, that you're gonna be hearing the bang and knowing about, well, I wonder between the lawnmower and the car, well, you know that the thunder that don't sound like that even lightly, because you know that more likely the thunder sounds like, but then on your hand, rolling thunder sounds like, and you're like wondering to where, yeah, there's something but the that I don't like. But other than that, I talk about right here is that with these junkyard, with the junkyard parts and accessories, and we're like wondering to where at the time that if anybody were wondering to where that why would you want to weld the door shut on the car anyway? Because you won't be. How would you be able to get in? Climb in through the window, and I'm gonna go ahead and put the car in drive, and I'm gonna put it in reverse, and I'm gonna go ahead and drive it. And I like wondering, well, but still, that if anybody were wondering to where, yeah, there's something about that that I don't like. And what does it sound like when? What does it sound like whenever you put the key in the ignition, huh? It sounds like and like for any type of car that you may have, that more likely it sounds like but instead it sounds like but on the other hand, that you have I talk about here for salvage vehicles, so for any type of salvage vehicle, and you're like going to her at the time that if anybody were to probably think about is to her that you're somebody that wants to tear up an old car, you're going to get into the driver's side right here, and that you're like worrying to her that yeah, that if the car was built in the junkyard, you take it out on the street and you drive it anywhere you need to go. But then by the time it comes to a rest stop in the junkyard, you would probably think that yeah, you built it here and it's going to break down here, and you're more likely going to tear it up here. But half the time, if anybody that wonders this to her, try to fix it up and try to get it running again, and you're like wondering to her, what's there to fix? What is there to fix? It's like, well, there may be a few things that you could fix also if you had the right tools and stuff, but like, yeah, well, I tell you one thing that for knowing about how old is too old, just for for a new car, because you're like warrantor that if anybody that may warrantor that for anything like related to like classics or anything like that, and at the time that if anybody will warrantor, the last thing I got to worry about is the fact about is to while I'm driving and find out that maybe if I don't have no brakes or some sort, and you're like warrantor, well, whatever happened to the brakes? They rusted off. That's what happened. Like, well, they rust. Yeah, engine parts rust. Like this, they rust. But other than that, what I talk about here is like between if they melted or if they rusted, whichever it is. But there's something about the that I don't like. Yeah, well, there's something about the that you're talking about just right down the street, huh? But then you have right here is like the tire right here, and along with a few other. We weren't to her necessarily that like for anything related to like salvage vehicles, and we're like weren't to her that between 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and like I say, if anybody's going to be driving to work with one of those old clunkers, and at the time that you're like weren't to her. That yeah, well, the car is so old. I'm like at the time, if anyone wonders as to where that if anything that's gonna be what you call outdated or anything like that. But the way I think about though is like for like anything about salvage joke though is like I have right here's a lawnmower right here, and knowing about that yeah that anything that what you call is like between the sounds of between the rolling and then the running and then the rolling. And you're like warrant where yeah that does an engine run really does it really you still run does the engine still run even whenever it's parked in a junkyard? Well, here's a saying, whenever you hear the sound of like and you hear the sound of like and then and then you also hear the sound of whenever you're at the junkyard and thinking about is to where that between what you call, it's like the grinding, or if it's the welding, or if it's anything about, anything really to like getting to the salvage yards, and you're like wondering that, hey, you're gonna be driving the car, and half the time you're gonna be in the driver's seat, and half the time you're like really that if the car is only going to be driving about maybe 25 mile an hour, and let's just say if it does get good gas mileage, what are you going to do for lunch and dinner? Are you going to stop for coffee, maybe at the nearest coffee shop? Like a bang, bang, bang. Well, I tell you one thing that I'll look in the trunk. You ain't even got a trunk, man. You just got a back seat. Like, well, then I'll just have to look in the back seat to see if I have anything to use to keep the engine running. Well, I say, yeah, well, you ought to be lucky it even has an engine, because, yeah, that engine is about to say, like, about ready to give out. There's something about that I don't like. Yeah, well, you all heard that story before, huh? That people that maybe not like us to where that whenever their cars break down, and one of those issues could be is to where maybe a failure on the equipment or a failure on the engine parts, but half the time you're like worrying to where about whenever the car that stops running, right? And you're like worrying to where what are you going to do whenever it reaches at least maybe 140,000 or so miles on it? And I say, well, maybe that don't make a difference, does it? I just think, well, you ought to think about it as to where there are ways of knowing about whenever the car is ready to play it out, and half the time that you're knowing about is that, yeah, that the last thing I gotta remember is to where that is like the title to the car, whichever it is, and like knowing about the right engine parts or so, and sometimes it's like you just to be able to keep the car running, but we're like worrying to where that I want that car so I could turn. Like, well, you're going to need the right tools, sir, ma'am. I tell you one thing, I need the car to drive back and forth to work. Well, what do the people over there at your job say about you driving that old car of yours? I'm like, yeah, half the time we weren't toward that we know that whenever somebody's there at work, because about every other morning or so that they're going to hear and then you're like worrying to her, well, that ain't the sound of a pickup truck or rolling thunder that you're talking about. Oh, well, you talk about that rolling thunder. Well, if that's what you mean, yeah, yeah, I'm talking about, and half the time you're like worrying to her, really? I'm like, what does the car, what does the car sound like? Maybe whenever you just changed the oil. Whenever you just change the oil, whenever you put some new transmission fluid in there, whenever you just change the oil, it sounds like this. Well, I tell you one thing, that car, I'm like, well, I'll tell you one thing, I'll know about whenever I'm ready to get rid of it. But on your hand to talk about right here, you guys like you're driving the car and you're driving it until it beats dust, right? But then on your hand, you're like wearing to her really between 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're like, yeah. Yeah, is that water heater again? Well, well, unfortunately, and maybe that I want that car. I want that car. But on your hand, I talk about, say, for anything about, for salvage joke, though. But other than that, I talk about here for whenever we turn the key in the ignition, and I wanted to worry about what does it sound like. You say for rolling thunder. Rolling thunder. But on your hand, too, that was anything about rolling thunder as well, and rolling thunder could be like well, I tell you one thing, it's between what you call, for chitty chitty bang bang, or what you call it, or I wanted to her that there's something about the baby that I just want to get. there's something about the baby that I just want to get. Like, are you calling that baby? Like, oh, that baby right there. Like, well, there's something about the that I don't like. But on the other hand, too, I can, oh, well, I'll tell you one thing. I'll show you, like, the way I think about it is to where, really, between knowing about what car, how can we tell if it's a he or a she? And I'll probably say maybe from the model design or maybe from the color. But at the time, you're like wanting to where that, for like any salvage vehicles, especially the kind that sounds like bah, 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 and you're like, well, there's something about the that I don't like. Like, well, I wonder if the females are known as between the or if the males are known as by or if like they talk about yeah, and then knowing about which one is the cousin. I what? Like, no, like, yeah, yeah, right here, talk about, between the cousin, the cousin more likely would be but on your hand, too, there's something but that I don't like. But other than that, say, Manny Mc25 and talk, I say, for the Salvage Joke, and talk about if anybody say that, yeah, I did not even come to the Salvage Joke, just to be able to get any parts. I tell you one thing, I came here and started to look for that car. Well, that car, well, unfortunately, it was in that spot right there. But then, actually, it was here 2 hours ago. But then we think we heard it just right up the street. And after about maybe 2 hours later, and find out that, yeah, that 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 you were talking about, like, yeah, it can use a new paint job. But on your hand, that you're like warrant tour, if anybody were a warrant tour, that the car was parked in the salvage yard for about 2 hours this evening. And fortunately, they can't get the doors open. Well, maybe because I welded the doors shut, that's what happened. Like, well, why'd you weld the doors shut? Because I'm getting ready to know about it, like, get ready for the race. Like, oh, okay, well, I tell you one thing, between what we calls, like, I thought you came here, just to be able to fix the car up. I didn't know that you were going to be taking it apart. Like, well, it is coming apart. If you didn't know that, because if you notice, like, the license plate right now is if it's on there or if it's off of there. But still, that knowing about before it's like with the classic though, and knowing about the turning to keep the ignition right there. And if anybody like wanted to, between the rocking and the rolling and then the roll and then the running or whatever it is, like between bah, 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 or bah, 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 and I'm like it's about time it's like that engine is about to have its time. But on the other hand, that you're talking about this, there's something about the engine parts that I just want to know about. I wonder if the engine parts have any type of song, such as or okay, that's enough. Like, and you're like more toward the sound of the brakes. The sound of the brakes that sound like it's time to slow down now. But other than hand talk about this, like for Salvage Joke 4, Manny 25, and thanks for watching. If anybody ever wonders, it's like, well, why don't you just park that darn thing and leave it in park? Like, oh, well, I'll tell you one thing, I have it in park, and now I gotta put it in reverse. I get, but on there too, it's like you're between a junkyard mess in business, and you're like one tour, like, park the darn thing. Oh, I just want to come back from work. I wonder if that parking brake even still works because I don't even remember installing it. Like, well, I tell you one thing, there's something about the that I like worrying to where that any other parts that more likely to come with the car, and you're like worrying to her about anything about salvage parts, and sometimes you're like worrying to her really that that there's been possible chances to where that there's been a lot of work done on the inside, but knowing about what about the outside. Like, and yeah, well, the outside is pretty much dust. But on the other hand, they talk about, say, between, like, well, why don't you just park that darn thing and leave it in park? Like, park the darn thing! Like, there's something about the that I don't like. But other than that, talk about it for Joke Yard Mess. You Salvage Joke 4. Thanks for watching.